Every single person who has ever died in space died on a mission someone approved. Someone signed the paperwork. Someone cleared the launch. Someone looked at the warning and said, "It'll be fine." These aren't just accidents. They're decisions, human decisions made under pressure, under political deadlines, and sometimes under fear of what would happen if someone said no. This is the story of the deadliest space missions ever, and what really went wrong. In 1967, the Soviet Union was in a race, not just with America, but with time itself. The 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution was coming, and the Kremlin wanted a triumph in space to celebrate it. They had a spacecraft. It was called Soyuz 1. And they had a cosmonaut, Vladimir Komarov, who was one of the most experienced pilots in the Soviet program. There was just one problem. Engineers had filed over 200 technical faults with the Soyuz 1 spacecraft before launch. More than 200. The solar panels didn't deploy correctly in tests. The attitude control system was unreliable. Multiple systems were flagged as dangerously incomplete. Komarov knew. He knew the ship was broken. And according to people close to him, so did his best friend, a man named Yuri Gagarin, the first human ever to travel to space. The plan had originally been for Gagarin to be the backup pilot on this mission. And here's the part that stays with you. Komarov reportedly chose to fly himself, rather than let Gagarin take his place, because he believed the spacecraft would fail. He didn't want Gagarin to die. Think about that. He strapped himself into a spacecraft he believed would kill him, to protect his friend. Soyuz 1 launched on April 23, 1967. Almost immediately, things went wrong. The solar panels failed. The attitude control system failed. The spacecraft began spinning uncontrollably. Ground control scrambled to bring him home. After 26 hours in orbit, Komarov began his re-entry. And then, the parachute failed. The primary chute tangled. The backup chute tangled in the first. Komarov was hurtling toward the Earth at terminal velocity. In his final moments, according to recovered transmissions, he was furious. Not frightened, furious, cursing the people who had sent him up in a ship they knew was broken. He hit the ground at roughly 140 kilometers per hour. The impact was so violent the spacecraft caught fire. What they found afterward could only be identified by a single heel bone. Vladimir Komarov was 40 years old. He was the first human being to die on a space mission, and almost everyone who sent him up knew the risk before he launched. 4 years later, the Soviets tried again. This time, they succeeded, brilliantly. The crew of Soyuz 11, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev docked with Salyut 1, the world's very first space station. They lived and worked aboard it for 23 days. They conducted experiments, observed the Earth below, and became heroes long before they landed. On June 30, 1971, they separated from the station and began their journey home. The re-entry went perfectly. The parachutes deployed exactly as planned. The capsule drifted gently down to the Kazakhstan steppe and landed without a single problem. Recovery teams raced over and opened the hatch. All 3 men were sitting in their seats, perfectly still, no visible injuries, no sign of distress. They looked like they were asleep. They were dead, all 3 of them. What investigators later found was devastating in its simplicity. During separation from the station, a pressure equalization valve had opened, a valve the size of a coin, when it wasn't supposed to. In seconds, the cabin depressurized. Space is vacuum. The human body cannot survive that. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds. There was nothing the crew could have done. The valve was technically accessible inside the capsule, but there were over 30 possible valves, and in the chaos of an undetected depressurization, with their vision failing and consciousness fading, they had no way to find the right one in time. There's a detail about Viktor Patsayev that never leaves me.
he was found with bruising on his hands consistent with trying to manually close a valve. He was still trying to fix it, right until the end. Because of Soyuz 11, the Soviets completely redesigned their crew capsules. Every cosmonaut would now wear a pressure suit during launch and re-entry. It was a change that should have existed from the very beginning. 3 men, a valve the size of a coin, and a redesign that came one mission too late. January 28, 1986 was one of the coldest mornings in Florida history. The temperature at Kennedy Space Center had dropped well below freezing overnight. Ice had formed on the launch structure. Engineers were worried. Specifically, engineers at a company called Morton Thiokol were worried about the rubber O-rings, seals in the solid rocket boosters that were designed to prevent hot gases from escaping. The night before the launch, they had held an emergency teleconference with NASA. They argued that the O-rings had never been tested at temperatures this low. They recommended delaying the launch. NASA pushed back. The launch had already been delayed multiple times. There was pressure, enormous pressure, to fly. One NASA manager on the call reportedly told the Thiokol engineers to, quote, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." In other words, stop thinking like scientists. Start thinking about the schedule. Thiokol's management overruled their own engineers and approved the launch. At 11:38 in the morning, Challenger lifted off. The 7 crew members were on board, including Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and a schoolteacher from New Hampshire named Krista McAuliffe, who had been selected from over 11,000 applicants to become the first civilian in space. 73 seconds after launch, Challenger broke apart. The O-ring had failed exactly the way the engineers warned it would. Hot gas burned through the seal, destabilized the rocket booster, and tore the vehicle apart. Across America, families gathered around televisions to watch a teacher go to space. Many of those televisions were in classrooms. Children watched it happen live. The investigation that followed was devastating, not because the cause was mysterious. It wasn't. It was devastating because the cause had been predicted. In writing, the night before, by the people who built the part that failed. When physicist Richard Feynman sat on the investigation commission, he dropped an O-ring into a glass of ice water during a televised hearing and showed the world exactly how it became brittle in the cold. It took 32 seconds. That was the entire explanation. 7 people, 1 degree of temperature, and a decision made by a manager who was thinking about the calendar instead of the physics. 17 years after Challenger, NASA flew another mission that had a known problem aboard, and chose to believe it wouldn't matter. On January 16, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia launched on mission STS-107. 82 seconds after liftoff, a piece of foam insulation broke off from the external fuel tank and struck the leading edge of Columbia's left wing. Engineers saw it in the launch footage. They flagged it. They asked for better imaging, satellite imagery, spy satellite imagery, anything that could show them the extent of the damage. The requests were declined or deprioritized. Management concluded, based on past foam strikes that hadn't caused catastrophic damage, that this one probably hadn't either. There's an email from a NASA engineer named Rodney Rocha, written during the mission. He wrote, "I am not comfortable with the answer that foam damage is not a safety of flight issue." He sent it internally. Nothing changed. Aboard Columbia, the crew of 7 had no idea. Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, and mission specialists Kalpana Chawla, Laurel Clark, David Brown, Michael Anderson, and Ilan Ramon, Israel's first astronaut, continued their science experiments for 16 days. They were, by all accounts, a close-knit crew. Their in-flight video shows them laughing, floating through the cabin, showing off for the camera. On February 1, 2003, Columbia began its re-entry over the Pacific Ocean. The hole in the wing, roughly the size of a dinner plate, allowed superheated plasma at nearly 1,500 degrees Celsius to enter the wing structure. Sensors in the left wing began failing, one by one. Mission Control watched the data degrade in real time. At 8:59 in the morning, communication with Columbia was lost. Over the southern United States, people looked up and saw streaks of light crossing the sky. Columbia was disintegrating at nearly 18 times the speed of sound, 60 kilometers above the Earth. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board later found that the foam strike alone was not necessarily a death sentence. Had the damage been properly assessed, there were options: emergency spacewalk repair attempts, an emergency rescue mission using Atlantis. None of those options were explored because NASA had decided the problem wasn't serious. The board's report said something that cuts to the bone. It said that Columbia was lost not just because of a piece of foam, but because of organizational silence. The culture of NASA had made it difficult for engineers to raise safety concerns up the chain of command. It was Challenger 17 years later. Same agency, same pattern, different shuttle. Most people have never heard of Michael J. Adams. He doesn't appear in the textbooks next to Komarov or Challenger. But he died in space. And his story is one of the strangest and most quietly heartbreaking in aviation history. In 1967, the X-15 was the most advanced aircraft ever built. A rocket-powered experimental plane that flew to the edge of space, above 80 kilometers, which, by the United States Air Force definition, made its pilots astronauts. On November 15, 1967, Adams flew what would be his seventh and final X-15 flight. The plan was to reach an altitude of around 80 kilometers, conduct some experiments, and return. At peak altitude, something went wrong in the adaptive control system. The aircraft entered a hypersonic spin, rotating at around 15 revolutions per second at the edge of space. Adams fought to regain control, and briefly did. But when the aircraft re-entered the denser atmosphere, it was in a dive at Mach 5, 5 times the speed of sound. At that speed and angle, the aerodynamic forces exceeded what the X-15's airframe was designed to withstand. The aircraft broke apart at around 20,000 meters. Adams was killed instantly. For decades, Adams received almost none of the recognition given to the other astronaut casualties. It wasn't until 2004, 37 years after his death, that the Air Force posthumously awarded him astronaut wings, officially acknowledging that he had died in space. He was 37 years old. He had flown combat missions in Korea, graduated from Harvard, trained as a test pilot, and made it to the edge of the universe. And then came back through the atmosphere just slightly too fast, at just the wrong angle, because a sensor malfunctioned. His name is on the memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. Most people walk past it without knowing who he is. 5 missions, 14 people, and in almost every case the same story underneath. Not bad luck. Not the unknowable cruelty of the universe. Decisions. Choices made by human beings who prioritized schedules over safety, politics over physics, optimism over evidence. Komarov flew because the Soviet Union needed a headline. Challenger flew because a manager overruled an engineer. Columbia flew home without a rescue attempt because someone decided the foam strike was probably fine. Space is unforgiving. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about deadlines or anniversaries or political optics. It simply waits, and when you give it an opening, it takes it. The astronauts and cosmonauts in this video weren't reckless. They weren't naive. Most of them knew, in some quiet part of themselves, that the odds weren't fully in their favor. They flew anyway, because they believed in what they were doing, because someone had to go first, because the dream of space is one of the most powerful things the human race has ever reached for. The least we can do is remember what it cost, and learn, actually learn, from the people we lost trying to get there.